right. Thank you for the song this morning. We'll be returning to Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 36. In our series through the book of number 43, entitled Prophet. And we'll be looking here at chapter 36. I'll read verses 1 and 3 to get started. Now it came to pass in the 14th year of King Hezekiah that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the defense cities of Judah and took them. And the king of Assyria sent Rabshakeh from Lachish to Jerusalem unto King Hezekiah with a great army. And he stood by the conduit of the upper pool in the highway of the fuller's field. Then came forth unto him Eliakim, Hilkiah's son, which was over the house, and Shebna the scribe, and Joah, Asaph's son, the recorder. So, chapter 34 and 35 that we have covered now form a summary conclusion to the section of Isaiah I referred to as the Book of Woes, which is chapters 28 to 35. And so, those two chapters function as a pair. They work together, and they're consistent really with what we have seen in the first part of Isaiah, blending of judgment and restoration prophecies. Now, after the judgments are pronounced in chapter 34, chapter 35 ends on a strong note of restoration and describing future kingdom blessings. It's one of those of which there are several passages in Isaiah where really we get the most extensive description of kingdom conditions when the Messiah comes and establishes his kingdom on this earth. And we saw in that chapter there was an emphasis on land restoration, both in terms of inheritance and also in terms of reversal of the curse upon the earth, so that the land became well watered and fruitful and brought forth abundantly. And also, chapter 35 included a strong message of encouragement. Yes, these judgments are coming, but the faithful word to take comfort in these prophecies, and really that is a good word to us as well, concerning those things that are still yet to be fulfilled. Now, chapters 36 to 39 are the final section of this first major part of Isaiah's prophecy. And chapters 36 and 39 primarily center around the invasion of Jerusalem. So these chapters actually resolve the threat of Assyria and then look forward to the rise of Babylon and even Judah's eventual exile. So even though it's not emphasized from the very beginning of Isaiah to this point, the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel has occurred, and their situation has mostly been a warning to the southern kingdom of Judah. In other words, Isaiah's prophecy has focused on Judah, although there has been words to Israel as well. Now, chapters 36 to 39 are somewhat different from all the chapters we've had to this point in Isaiah. And the main difference is that they are primarily historical accounts, almost word for word, in fact, with 2 Kings chapters 18 to 20, and very closely paralleling the account in 2 Chronicles chapters 29 to 32. So these chapters particularly function at the end of this because the first part, there's a clear division in Isaiah between chapters 1 to 39 and then chapters 40 to 66. And so these chapters, 36 to 39, function as a summary, really, of chapters 1 to 35, in which the Assyrians were the primary enemy. They were the primary threat that's under consideration, particularly going all the way back to Ahaz in the early chapters of Isaiah. And so this invasion of Jerusalem, and really when you think about chapters 36 to 39, they provide a historical record of fulfillment of many prophecies that have come in chapters 1 to 35 in Isaiah. So for instance, Isaiah 7 verses 17 to 20 spoke of how Assyria would be a razor in God's hand that he would use against Judah. In chapter 8 verses 5 to 8, Judah was told that Assyria would overwhelm and would overflow them like a flood, but it would come up to the neck and would not go any further. So, in other words, it would not completely drown them. Isaiah chapter 10 speaks of how that Assyria was God's rod in his hand that he would use to punish Israel and Judah, but that he would also judge Assyria for their arrogance. Chapter 14 of Isaiah prophesied how that Assyria will be broken and it's going to happen in the land of Judah. Chapter 30 of Isaiah, the Assyrians will be struck down. They'll be struck down by divine judgment. In other words, going into chapter 31, there's an emphasis that it's not going to be the sword of man. In other words, it's not Judah's army, and it's not going to be their alliance with Egypt and coalition of armies that's going to defeat Assyria in the land of Judah, but that God is going to clearly do it without man's help or intervention. And then we're seeing all those prophecies concerning Assyria, many of them prophecies fulfilled here in chapters 36 to 39. It was prophesied that Assyria would be judged back in chapter 10 of Isaiah because of the king of his boasting, arrogant boasting. And in chapter 14, that the Lord's plan against Assyria will not be thwarted. In other words, everything's going to go according to God's plan. And in chapter 30, the Assyrians will be struck down again by the divine hand. And again, we see these things fulfilled. There's other prophecies, and in fact, it's been prophesied several times beforehand in Isaiah that Jerusalem would be preserved. So in chapter 10, we're told that a remnant would return and survive, and we've seen how those prophecies had a more immediate, near fulfillment as well as future implications. In chapter 29, it is said that nations that fight against Jerusalem will vanish like a dream when you wake up and the dream is gone. Chapter 30, Jerusalem will weep no more and God will answer her cries. Chapter 31, the Lord will defend Jerusalem and will be like a hovering bird hovering over its young and protecting them. Isaiah chapter 33, Zion will be the unshaken city. Because the Lord is its true king. And we see these things fulfilled in this part of Isaiah, especially those immediate near fulfillments. There's further prophecy. Remember that with Ahaz, the problem was he was actually making a secret alliance with Assyria. And then you come forward to Hezekiah, and the problem in Hezekiah's day, he was trying to make a secret alliance with Egypt. Well, it was told that trusting Egypt would be folly, it would fail. And so in chapter 20 of Isaiah, we're told that Egypt and Cush, that alliance would fail. Chapter 30, that turning to Egypt was on the one hand rebellion against God, and on the other hand, it was actually worthless because it was not going to succeed. In chapter 31, Egypt is only flesh and is not spirit, and it will not be able to save them. And then furthermore, we could talk about Babylon. Because in the first part of Isaiah, Assyria is prominent. There's no question about that. They're the world power. They're the ones that are conquering nations. They're pushing their expansion and all of these things. But there are some mentions of Babylon because Babylon was on the rise. So in chapters 13 and 14, the actual rise and fall of Babylon is foretold. In chapter 21, Babylon is already mentioned. It's already on that horizon, as it were. And we see that by the end, in chapters 36 to 39, that by the end, Babylon is mentioned. Babylon has those envoys that go and visit Hezekiah. And then also the Babylonian exile is foretold in chapter number 39. Now, there actually are more than that, but those are just primary prophecies that have come in the first 35 chapters of Isaiah, where we actually see fulfillments of those prophecies in chapters 36 to 39. And we know that those started back in the days beginning with Uzziah and the end of Uzziah's days and coming through the days of Ahaz and coming into the time of Hezekiah. So those are prophecies that have been spoken for decades in some cases at this time that we see some fulfillments here in this chapter. So we're starting this section with chapter 36. And it begins, and it's mostly the words of Rabshakeh, which that, as I understand it, is a title, was a high-ranking officer to Sennacherib. And his aim in this chapter, as they have been taking fortified cities within Judah, and they've come now to where really Jerusalem is the primary target. And their aim is to get Jerusalem to surrender, to get Hezekiah and Jerusalem to surrender without a fight. That's what they're trying to accomplish. And so he comes forth with that motive. And his words are recorded. And it's just another one of those instances where we have to pay attention to the context, because some of the things Rabshakeh says is true and some of them are not. So we have to pay attention to when he's speaking. These are his words, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're true. They have to be evaluated. So this chapter begins with the revelation of a real test for Hezekiah and Judah. In other words, who are they going to trust? Because it has come to their door. And who are they going to trust? And will they trust in the Lord? And that's actually been a recurring question through the first part of Isaiah to this point. And it's a point of emphasis. So theologically, what we read in Isaiah to this point is God's sovereignty over nations, over history. That's been evident. He's given signs confirming his word. He has spoken of Assyria and how that they're acting unknowingly as his agents. All the nations are subjected to him. But trusting God and believing in his sovereignty doesn't eliminate that human responsibility. And so that is given sort of flesh and blood here through the actions and such of Hezekiah. So in chapter 36, we'll look at verses 1 to 12, where we see the first attempt by Rabshakeh and his propaganda. And then in verses 13 to 22, the second attempt. So we'll start with the first one. Let's look at verses 1 to 3 again. Now it came to pass in the 14th year of King Hezekiah that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the defense cities of Judah and took them. And the king of Assyria sent Rabshakeh from Lachish to Jerusalem unto King Hezekiah with a great army, and he stood by the conduit of the upper pool in the highway of the fuller's field. Then came forth unto him Eliakim, Hilkiah's son, which was over the house, and Shebna the scribe, and Joah-Asaph's son, the recorder. So the first 3 verses of this chapter give us this historical setting and actually introduce us to the fact that we're reading a historical record, for the most part, a historical record in these chapters that form this final section of the first part. So these events occurred, and we correlate them with 2 Kings, with 2 Chronicles, and these events occurred about 701 BC. But 701 BC, if you calculate it, is not the 14th year of Hezekiah's reign. So it seems like that there's an inconsistency. In fact, if you look at 2 Kings chapter 18 and verse number 1, you can sort of add up those times, and you can see some inconsistency there. But then later in 2 Kings 18, it also mentions the 14th year of Hezekiah's reign. So, what do we do with things like this? Is this disproving the Bible? Is it throwing doubt? Well, if you're interested in chronology of studying the Kings, and really, and not even necessarily within the Bible, but even just historically outside of biblical record, these chronologies are extremely complex. I read a book on this some time back, but to try to calculate these reigns of kings, because sometimes the information is not reliable, and sometimes they may reign for a part of a year and it's counted as a whole year, and so after a while you can see how that starts to add up. You've got this sort of an inaccuracy that would seem to start adding up and making trouble with dates to try to be highly precise. So there's also an issue of what is referred to as co-regency. So there are times when a man is a king, and maybe he's in his older age, and maybe he's in poor health, and his son actually begins to reign, but the king is not yet dead, and he's not totally out of the picture, and that's what's referred to as co-regency. And so sometimes when you're trying to calculate the reign of a king, it can be difficult because of a lot of these issues. Now, it was the case, as far as we can tell, with Ahaz and Hezekiah. They were father and son, and Hezekiah began to reign before Ahaz died. And so it seems that the most logical explanation is that this 14th year that is mentioned is actually the 14th year of his sole reign. He had years of reign that would have been prior to this when Ahaz was still alive, and then he has the years of reign when Ahaz was gone. Hezekiah is fully the king, and there is no others. And so, and that's not uncommon. It happens in trying to figure out and piece together historical chronologies. So that again, there's not really a problem there. It just seems an inconsistency we have to look at. Now, the invasion by the Assyrians that's spoken of here, when they come up and they started taking these fortified cities of Judah, this was actually prophesied already. We've already noted that back in the earlier chapters prior to this, that had been prophesied years before this. And Hezekiah, in his situation, he had inherited tribute to Assyria from Ahaz. See, part of Ahaz, part of the deal that Ahaz had with the Assyrians that backfired was that Judah ended up coming under tribute to Assyria and having to pay them. And so Hezekiah inherited that and continued it for a time, but eventually he rebelled and he refused to pay Assyria. And that's what led to this invasion, by the way, because they're coming. One of the objectives of Sennacherib's messengers coming to Jerusalem, one of the objectives is to get them to surrender without a fight. The other objective is to get the payment that they are due that hasn't been paid. Now, Assyria had captured, by this point, over 40 fortified cities within the land and kingdom of Judah. They were essentially sort of marching down the coast and had come to Lachish. Sennacherib then sent Rabshakeh and other officials with a large army to Hezekiah at Jerusalem. And so the plan, which is evident when you read these two chapters, the plan was essentially a form of psychological warfare. They're attempting to manipulate and intimidate Hezekiah into surrender and sort of being backed up with the threat of this large army that Assyria had amassed, and the fact that no one had been able to successfully withstand them at that point. So these three representatives then from Hezekiah go out to meet them, and then we begin to get their interaction. So verses 4 to 10 give us 6 particular assertions from Rabshakeh. That this is his strategy as he's trying to intimidate and manipulate them. And Rabshakeh said unto them, Say ye now to Hezekiah, Thus saith the great king, the king of Assyria, What confidence is this wherein thou trustest? I say, sayest thou, but they are but vain words. I have counsel and strength for war. Now on whom dost thou trust that thou rebellest against me? Lo, thou trustest in the staff of this broken reed on Egypt, whereon if a man lean, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh king of Egypt to all that trust in him. But if thou say to me, We trust in the Lord our God, is it not he whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah hath taken away, and said to Judah and to Jerusalem, Ye shall worship before this altar? Now therefore give pledges, I pray thee, to my master the king of Assyria, and I will give thee 2,000 horses. And if thou be able on thy part to set riders thereupon, how then wilt thou turn away the face of one captain of the least of my master's servants, and put thy trust on Egypt for chariots and for horsemen? And am I now come up without the Lord against this land to destroy it? The Lord said unto me, Go up against this land and destroy it. So again, we have 6 primary assertions that Rabshakeh makes here. The first one that we see in verse number 4, which is really just sort of starts out with mockery. He's starting out with an intimidation. He is making the king of Assyria to be so great and powerful, and Hezekiah essentially to be very small and weak. And really, the kingdom of Judah at this point was rather small, particularly in comparison to the Assyrians and the armies that they had. So that's how he starts. That's how he sets the stage. In verse number 5, he gives the second. And what he's asserting here in verse number 5 is the power of Assyria, that they're not possibly going to be able to withstand. He's going to sow doubt within their minds, that if they have any ideas of trying to withstand a siege and an assault from Assyria, there's no way that they could do that. Now, in verse number 6, we get the third assertion, which is Rabshakeh saying to them that Egypt is unreliable. Now, again, to this point, these are his words. These are his words that he's using, psychological warfare against Hezekiah and Judah. But what he says in verse 6, it is true. Egypt was unreliable. They had been taken over by the Cushite dynasty. They were somewhat unstable, and ultimately they were unsuccessful at this point in history in being able to resist the Assyrians. And so we already saw in previous chapters recently how that trusting in Egypt was a foolish move on the part of Hezekiah and Judah. And even though the word of God from Isaiah had told them not to do this, Hezekiah eventually capitulated and did seek that alliance with Egypt. He uses this imagery. He says Egypt is like a broken reed. In other words, it's about like leaning on a thorn for support. You know, it's going to hurt you, and that's essentially what he's saying to them. Then verse number 7. This is the fourth assertion. And this actually is again where we have to pay attention to the context, because this is a false statement. So Rabshakeh is actually trying to cast doubt on Hezekiah in the minds of the people of Judah, because look what he did. He's violating the worship of your God by taking down all these high places and altars. Well, in this, Rabshakeh is just completely wrong. He just shows his ignorance here, because he doesn't understand that Hezekiah removing those things that had appeared in the earlier days was actually the right thing to do. That was endorsed by Yahweh, because that is he was to be served and worshipped in Jerusalem at the temple and there alone. So Hezekiah in that was acting faithfully and acting right. So this was just simply, again, it's just ignorance. He doesn't really understand the worship of Yahweh, and he thinks that these altars and things have been removed, because that's what all the other nations did with the worship of their gods. Then we get to verses 8 and 9. And this is the fifth assertion here. And essentially in verses 8 and 9, he's demanding the pledge. He's demanding the tribute that they owe. And he's saying that he'll give them horses. In other words, he'll actually add to their army. But he's pointing out that if he adds to their army, they don't have the manpower to even take advantage of it. And their trust in Egypt and the horses and the chariots and such will fail. So he's sowing that doubt. He's pointing out their weaknesses. They're not going to be able to stand against Assyria. And then we get to the sixth one in verse number 10. And again, we get another false statement. He's saying that Yahweh told him to go up to this land and destroy it. And this is, as I understand it, historically was quite a common tactic. When a nation had conquered another nation, the gods of that nation that was conquered would be viewed as weak, or either weak, or they had turned their displeasure against that nation, and so they had essentially handed them over for conquest. And so he's using those sort of terms, but he's speaking here in terms of Yahweh, because he doesn't know Yahweh, the God of heaven, and he doesn't know what he's like, and he doesn't know what he will do. So then we get verses 11 to 12. Then said Eliakim and Shebna and Joah unto Rabshakeh, Speak, I pray thee, unto thy servants in the Syrian language, for we understand it, and speak not to us in the Jews' language in the ears of the people that are on the wall. But Rabshakeh said, Hath my master sent me to thy master and to thee to speak these words? Hath he not sent me to the men that sit upon the wall, and they that may eat their own dung and drink their own piss with you? So this is the response, essentially, from the representatives of Hezekiah to this sort of first attempt from Rabshakeh. And really, they don't really make a response as much as they tell him to speak in Aramaic and not in Hebrew, essentially. And they don't want the men of Judah on the wall and within earshot to be able to hear and understand what's being said. And of course, Rabshakeh is going to respond to that he was sent to speak to all of Judah. And so he's going to speak to them in the language that they understand. He's going to continue to use Hebrew. And he's really kind of doubling down this part at the end of verse number 12, though sounding rather coarse to us and such. But what he's essentially saying is that they will lay siege on Jerusalem, and which will cause great famine and starvation within Jerusalem, something that they cannot outlast. And again, it's just a doubling down. So now we get to the last part, the second half of this chapter, and this is the second attempt by Rabshakeh with his propaganda that he's coming against Judah and Jerusalem. So in verses 13 to 20, we essentially get three more assertions from Rabshakeh. So let's look at verses 13 to 15. Then Rabshakeh stood and cried with a loud voice in the Jews' language and said, "Hear ye the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus saith the king, let not Hezekiah deceive you, for he shall not be able to deliver you. Neither let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord," that's in Yahweh, saying, "The Lord will surely deliver us. This city shall not be delivered into the hand of the king of Assyria." So this is the first of the three assertions. And again, he's attacking Hezekiah. He's trying to sow that doubt and to sow that dissension among the people of Judah. He's trying to get the people to question Hezekiah. And Hezekiah has essentially given them a message to trust in the Lord, that he will deliver. And so he's trying to throw doubt on that. Now, Hezekiah's message, though, wasn't unfounded. In other words, this isn't just an expression of a wish or a hope for Hezekiah necessarily. It's not based on anything, because Isaiah has already specifically prophesied that Jerusalem is going to be delivered. Now, this goes back to the time of Ahaz in chapter 10 and 14 and comes forward to the time of Hezekiah in chapters 31 and 33. Isaiah has already given specific prophecies that this is going to happen, but Jerusalem is going to be delivered. So what I'm saying is that Hezekiah has a basis. He has a reason for saying what he's saying and telling the people of Judah that they don't need to listen to the threats. They don't need to be overcome with fear. They simply need to trust in the Lord. And so again, here's where Rabshakeh was right. This was what Hezekiah was at this point saying to Judah. Verses 16 and 17. "Hearken not to Hezekiah, for thus saith the king of Assyria, make an agreement with me by a present, and come out to me, and eat ye every one of his vine, every one of his fig tree, and drink ye every one of the waters of his own cistern, until I come and take you away to a land like your own land, a land of corn and wine, a land of bread and vineyards." Now, this is the second assertion, and essentially here, Rabshakeh is making good-sounding but unreliable promises. Their goal, remember, was the surrender of Jerusalem without a fight. And so if they're trying to talk Judah out of Jerusalem, what is it that Judah might be concerned about? Well, that they're going to be slain by the Assyrians, that they're simply going to be killed. Jerusalem was also a well-defensed city and hard to take, but he's already there by the conduits, by the upper pools, which is the main water supply for the city at this point, which is where Ahaz was when he was trying to secure that against Israel and Syria earlier in the book of Isaiah. So in other words, it's very strategic that's where he shows up, because he cuts off that water supply. He's very quickly going to lead to famine conditions within the city, and he wanted them to surrender without a fight. So he's giving them promises of good treatment. He's trying to sort of allay their fears. Like they're not going to be slaughtered if they surrender and give the pledges that they're supposed to give. They're not going to be slaughtered, and not only that, they'll be able to live in good conditions. They'll have plenty of food and wine and all of these good things. And then, of course, you see the end game sort of revealed in verse 17, until he comes to take them away. They're not going to allow them to stay in Jerusalem and in Judah. They're going to be carried away, and Assyria is going to take over this land. But nevertheless, he's trying to assure them they won't be hurt, and they'll be well taken care of and well provided for. And so again, strategic, psychological, that he's trying to persuade them to pay up and to surrender. Verses 18 to 20. "Beware lest Hezekiah persuade you, saying, the Lord will deliver us. Hath any of the gods of the nations delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arphad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim? And have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? Who are they among all the gods of these lands that have delivered their land out of my hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand?" So this is now his third assertion, and he's sort of escalating as you can see. And he's directly attacking the God of Israel. And he's saying to them, the gods of all these nations that these nations revere and esteem and worship and regard so highly and view as so powerful, none of them have been able to deliver these nations, these cities out of our hands. And he even mentions Samaria, a reference to the northern kingdom of Israel, which has fallen 20, about 20 years or so earlier than when these words were being spoken. So he's comparing Yahweh to the gods of the nations that were unable to withstand Assyria. And once again, he's trying to sow that doubt. Don't let Hezekiah deceive you that you're going to be delivered, because no God has delivered any nation from the hands of Assyria. Then we see verses 21 and 22. But they held their peace and answered him not a word, for the king's commandment was, saying, answer him not. Then came Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, that was over the household, and Shebna the scribe, and Joah the son of Asaph, the recorder, to Hezekiah with their clothes rent, and told him the words of Rabshakeh. So here we get essentially the response of the messengers. And we're told very plainly that Hezekiah had commanded his representatives to stay silent. Don't answer him. Stay silent. And the only response that they made was the tearing of their clothes, a symbol of grief and mourning and consternation and all those sorts of things. But why would Hezekiah tell them to remain silent? And it becomes more apparent even as you go into the next chapter. He did this because he trusted the Lord and he would consult with the Lord. He didn't have to answer Rabshakeh or Sennacherib or any others. His faith, his trust, again, at this point, was in the Lord. He did waver earlier on, but Hezekiah is actually, in these particular chapters and instances, he is exemplary in faith. So even though Hezekiah wavered earlier in the matter of Egypt, in these accounts, he is trusting in the Lord, and in a way is fulfilling some of what has been told to Israel previously concerning trusting in the Lord. So in Isaiah 26, verses 3-4, perfect peace comes to those who trust in the Lord. Isaiah chapter 30 and verse 15, salvation comes through quiet trust, not through desperate alliances with other nations. Isaiah 32, verses 1-2, a righteous king will be a shelter from the storm. And verse 33 and chapter 33 and verse 2, that a prayer in distress will be answered. So this is beginning to come out here. It comes out even more in the next chapter. But Hezekiah at this point was trusting in the Lord. He didn't have any sort of hidden alliance. He didn't have any sort of secret plans. He didn't have any sort of secret weapon. He didn't have anything hidden that wasn't known about. He was just simply trusting in the Lord. So what is something that we learned through this events and as we continue on studying these chapters? Well, great faith and trusting Yahweh in this instance meant remaining silent before scorn and mockery. Remaining silent and rather speaking to the Lord. Now, there are many truth warriors in the world who seem to think that it's their duty to sort of sniff out anything and everything that's wrong and correct it, and always have to make a response, always got to say something. And that is not what they did here. And there's a lot of things that could be said about that, but we do see that here in this example, there's other places we could think of. You don't have to respond to and answer everything that someone says. I don't care how wrong that it is. It reminded me of actually a quote from Spurgeon, which I'm sure Steve will have more to quote from here in just a little bit. But Spurgeon made a comment about the best way of defending the Bible against attacks. And essentially he said that it was the faithful teaching and preaching of the Bible Here's what he said. There seems to me to have been twice as much done in some ages in defending the Bible as in expounding it. But if the whole of our strength shall henceforth go to the exposition and spreading of it, we may leave it pretty much to defend itself. I do not know whether you see that lion. It is very distinctly before my eyes. A number of persons advanced to attack him, while a host of us would defend the grand old monarch, the British lion, with all our strength. Many suggestions are made, and much advice is offered. This weapon is recommended, and the other. Pardon me if I offer a quiet suggestion. Open the door and let the lion out. He will take care of himself. Why, they're gone. He no sooner goes forth in his strength than his assailants flee. The way to meet infidelity is to spread the Bible. The answer to every objection against the Bible is the Bible. Again, that's Charles Spurgeon, but some wise words from him. And so there is a great dilemma here for all those self-appointed righter of wrongs, and I've had the dubious pleasure of knowing quite a few in my lifetime. Here's the dilemma. Will you start or will you end with yourself? That's really the dilemma, isn't it? I mean, after you've corrected everyone else, will you then correct yourself? Because, of course, none of us is free from error, nor is any of us appointed to such a post. So the message here is to trust God and to keep His words in our hearts and on our lips. And that is our responsibility. All right, stop here and we'll close with a hymn.